Welcome to Libeth. I'm glad you're here. This week we are in Heian, Japan, with the Tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu. What the Tale of Genji insists upon from the first line is not a single heroic plot, but a condition. A courtly order that circulates favors, poems, bodies, and rituals until those circulations take the place of story. The world the book builds is an architecture of influence, collars, ranks, presents, initiation ceremonies, and those outward forms let us see power as a living machine rather than a moral axis. The emperor's sheltering love in the Kiritsubo chapter behaves like political capital. Promotions, the offering of clan membership, and the arranging of sponsors are not background detail, but the precise way influence is extended and redistributed. Genji's rise happens as someone cued into that machinery. Gifts from treasuries, the careful choreography of rites, a fortune teller nodding at a boy's lineaments, the purple band tied and untied at an initiation. Each act enlarges his network, and in doing so, multiplies his obligations. The novel's opening movement is therefore not simply an introduction to characters, but a demonstration of how authority is legitimized in this world. Not through force, not through law, but through the accumulation and circulation of formal acts of recognition. To receive gifts is to be acknowledged. To be acknowledged is to acquire debts. To have debts is to be real. The system creates persons by obligating them. That expansion of influence is a species of control, and control in the Tale of Genji never narrows risk so much as it spreads responsibility. The more the emperor bends the household to shelter one woman, the more enemies gather in corridors and on bridges. The more Genji is surrounded by attendants, tutors, sponsors, and admirers, the more rooms open where someone else's sorrow can be left to fester. Kiritsubo's decline, the weeds in her mother's garden, the night messenger stumbling through clumps of mugwort, the emperor pacing beside the moonlit pots, makes this concrete. Protection raises exposure. Power is not a blunt solution to vulnerability. It is the condition that creates new vulnerabilities, obligations that multiply faster than the resources for meeting them. This is the formal structure of the book's first movement, and it establishes the pattern that all subsequent movements will repeat and vary. Elevation produces instability, and instability produces the conditions for the next elevation. The machine runs by converting stability into motion, and motion back into a new form of precarity. That multiplication shifts the tone of the book from triumphal narration into an atmosphere charged with attachment and mourning. Festivals and rehearsals, the wave dance under the red maples, the emperor's summons of magicians and poets, these moments glitter, and the prose will allow them their full ceremonial radiance. But every ceremonious brightness arrives from a place of prior loss. Celebration and lament run as a braided current through the text. A dance that dazzles by daylight will be answered by sleepless nights and small, private funerals. The novel's energy prefers composition to resolution. You feel the weight of a banquet and then a letter folded into a fan, and those letters function as the engine that moves people toward each other and away again. The mood is not a binary of joy versus sorrow. It is a continual modulation of feeling, an accumulation of small, unclosed transactions that replaces the single climactic reckoning we expect from other narrative forms. This refusal of climax is structural, not accidental. The Tale of Genji is constructed in 54 chapters, and those chapters do not build toward a single decisive scene. They accumulate, and the accumulation is itself the argument. That replacement matters because the Tale of Genji organizes itself into a three-part movement that keeps returning across episodes. Ascent, dissolution, aftermath. The early chapters are ascent, the Emperor's attention, the installing of Genji as the Shining One, the profusion of gifts and ceremonials that mark social elevation. Then come the dissolutions. Yugao wandering into a shabby riverside lodging and disappearing, the nightmares in that abandoned house, Rokujo's slow, corrosive jealousy, Fujitsubo's forbidden resemblance that turns a private affinity into public peril. Finally, the aftermath, the household that must carry on, the child reared in someone else's orbit, the later chapters that redistribute loss. These three motions are not a curve toward meaning. They are a rehearsal of consequences. Each ascent seeds dissolution, and dissolution deposits an emotional residue that later generations inherit as ordinary life. The book is not structured like a story in which things happen and then resolve. It is structured like a system in which consequences propagate, and new consequences emerge from old ones, so that the reader who finishes the last chapter is looking not at an ending, but at the most recent configuration of a process that began before the book opened and will continue after it closes. The book makes that inheritance literal by letting success produce instability. As Genji collects honors, he also accumulates attachments he cannot discharge. Lovers who expect him present, women whose reputations he cannot rebuild after scandal, dependents whose security now rests on his erratic attention. The fortune-teller's nod at the boy's face becomes, in practice, a destiny of social obligation. To place the child among the Minamoto is to tie him to a network the boy cannot refuse and cannot fully command. Success thus functions as a kind of leverage. It amplifies his reach while exposing him to more private treasons of feeling. The novel keeps showing us how a single act of favor blossoms into a forest of need, and in the middle chapters, that forest begins to overtake the cleared spaces of authority. What looked like mastery in the early chapters reads differently once we understand that every grant of patronage has created a dependent, and every dependent is a source of claims that cannot all be honored. That middle terrain is where dominance diffuses into diffusion, where the central figure's gravity blurs. Genji's presence, once the pivot around which scenes turn, begins to be less a point than a field. He slips into houses in disguise. He gives scarves and fans that circulate among other hands. His visits become stories people tell about themselves. By the time the narrative moves past the central sweep of his career, influence has spread into a network without a single bright center. This is not mere scattering. It is a structural shift. The text deliberately allows its symbolic center to disappear as a statement. Absence works as argument. When a person who once embodied the system withdraws or fades, the system keeps functioning. Gift exchanges continue. Poems keep traveling. Ceremonial duties go on. And that continuation after loss is itself an observation about how the court works. The system does not require its architect. It has been internalized by everyone who participated in it, and it runs on the accumulated habits of people who have stopped asking where those habits came from. The disappearance of a center forces the Tale of Genji to stage its emotional aftermath in rooms and small houses where instability lingers and mutates. Think of the discoloration of a formerly neat household after a death, or the little nurse's cottage where a child is raised in a shabby garden of evening faces. Those later episodes are not minor coda. They are the social accounting of what earlier honors refused to settle. In the book's latter part, The Uji chapters and the stories that follow inheritance is less legal and more effective. Kaoru and others inherit contradictions, not clear authority. They do not step into power so much as inherit ambivalence. Ideals left half-formed, loyalties diluted, and a polity that wears its outward order like a costume while its inside becomes uncertain. The novel maps that motion of diffusion onto psychological fragmentation. The later generation is more split, more uncertain, less capable of the charismatic coherences that once issued from a single figure. Kaoru is the court's second-generation problem, a man formed entirely by the consequences of Genji's actions, who has no access to the original confidence from which those actions flowed. This refusal of a tidy catharsis is deliberate. The Tale of Genji constructs repetition as architecture. Scenes recur: stolen evenings, exchanged poems, mothers and their stand-ins, not because the author cannot imagine variety, but because repetition is the form that reveals structure. Genji's relentless search for maternal substitutes is the most telling example. Fujitsubo resembles his lost mother. The vanished nurse's daughter who reappears as a child reminds him of previous losses. Even certain dresses and fans reappear as relics of the same desire. Desire here is a loop rather than a trajectory. It loops because grief remains unresolved. The book stages this looping not as neurosis alone, but as cultural rhythm. Time measured by returning motifs rather than by narrative closure. The seasons, the ceremonies, the annual progression of poetry occasions, all of these are mechanisms by which the court insists on cyclical time against the linear time of loss. The world goes around, the wound returns. The court's response is to make the return beautiful. Mono no aware, the gentle pain of things passing, acts less like a moral lesson and more like the novel's organizing rhythm. Seasonal passages thread through the chapters as pacing devices. The autumn equinox that sets an emperor to longing, the moonlight that shapes secret meetings, the full moon nights that bring out furtive poets and furtive lovers, the frost that reveals what has been hidden. The seasons are not background ornament. They are an emotional metronome. They increase the sense that impermanence intensifies attachment rather than diminishing it. Knowing that a blossom will fall makes its beauty more urgent. Knowledge of an inevitable absence makes possession compulsive. The scarf kept under a prince's garment, the returned fan folded with a poem, the dresses offered back as memory. These are symptom and method. Awareness of disappearance breeds possession, and possession becomes the only way to pace a life that cannot end neatly. The court understands intellectually that nothing lasts. It responds to that understanding not by releasing attachment, but by intensifying it, because attachment is the only form of meaning available to people who have been trained to find meaning in aesthetic response. Ceremony displaces action throughout the book. There are very few pitched battles because social coercion already happens invisibly. Reputation, subtle court pressures, arranged moves that unseat someone standing. So instead, the novel gives us rites. Initiations with purple files and ritual knives, funerals with proclamations read by the bier, purification services attended by a bewildered multitude. Those ceremonies take the place of action sequences because they are the society's real moves. The movement of plot is often carried by poetry exchanges rather than pursuits or fights. A verse inserted into a fan can start or stop a relationship. A clever line can be the lever that opens a door. The language of negotiation in Genji is poetic. Poems do cognitive labor. A verse is a summons, a refusal a bond. The narrator gives poems the weight of deeds, and that is how narrative progression is carried in this atmosphere of courtly etiquette. A reader who skims the poems skips the plot. The poems are not illustration, but event. Silence and omission are deliberate structural techniques. Some deaths the book narrates with the most intimate care, others it lets fall away like a shadow. The novel sometimes refuses to stage a violent finale, because disappearance matters more than spectacle. A lady dies in a shabby house amid mugwort, and the emperor reads a proclamation over her bier. The public ritual confers rank upon an absence that has already changed everything. Later, the most decisive vanishings, the leaving of a central figure's presence, the disintegration of certain relationships, arrive as gaps rather than events. The court is notably unable to narrate endings directly. It prefers to circle them with ceremony, to bind them with commemorative sutras, to place them within funeral ritual, and then to wait. That refusal to close the story is not accidental. It is a statement about a social grammar that would rather sustain form than risk wrenching the public narrative into the private finality of an answered plot. Genji's own death is the supreme instance. He is there, and then he is not. The chapter that would have described his end is simply absent, a gap in the manuscript that may be intentional or may be loss, and either way communicates the same thing, that the court's grammar has no adequate form for the final vanishing of its organizing principle. Women in the Tale of Genji speak in layers and allusion, and the narrator preserves that indirectness. A letter that returns a scarf, a poem that masks a complaint, a recollection voiced as a proverb. These are the ways women act within a structure that gives them agency precisely through nuance. The novel stages female speech as layered reference, so that meaning is displaced across images rather than asserted head-on. Sometimes a woman's courage appears as stubborn silence. Sometimes her voice arrives as a carefully placed line of verse that makes an entire room respond. The narrator habitually observes without casting blunt judgment, which creates a moral ambiguity built into the book's voice. We watch choices happen, feel their pressure, and remain without a final adjudication. There is no strict ethical map, because the narrative refuses to hand us one. Instead, we are made to live within the moral whether the characters produce. This moral weather is uncomfortable for readers trained to expect narrative to deliver a verdict. Murasaki's restraint is not timidity. It is a precise analysis of a world in which verdict is structurally impossible, because no one holds the kind of authority that verdict requires. This is why battle is largely absent, and religion appears mainly as exhaustion. When coercion is internalized in social form and grievance, takes the shape of quiet outrage rather than armies, the recourse is not to law but to liturgy. Priests are called when ritual fails to shift a spirit. Hermits are sought when courtly remedies exhaust themselves. Buddhist services arrive as consolation at the limit of worldly networks. The mountain hermit who cares for Genji's ague, the nun who shelters a child, the scriptures read at bedside. These are less metaphysical conversions than practical responses to social failure. Buddhism in the Tale of Genji creeps in as a late instrument of repair for a world that has ceased to resolve itself by honor alone. It appears when emotional structures buckle and withdrawal becomes the only form of autonomy left to those who cannot manage their obligations. The novel treats religious withdrawal not as enlightenment, but as defeat, and there is a quiet but insistent sadness in the scenes where characters retreat from the world they were formed to inhabit. Even survival in the book resists full reintegration. Some figures depart and return altered. Others, like Ukifune in the later sections, survive without being wholly absorbed into a restored order. That survival is ambiguous. It is endurance that does not mean reconciliation. The book ends not with a repaired social body, but with a suspended arrangement. Ceremonies continue, aristocratic rituals keep their shape, but the psychological cohesion is gone. The court remains beautiful on its surface. It maintains tapestries and dances and the ordering of ranks. Inside, people carry fragments of collapse. The inability to conclude is itself evidence. The world's exhaustion shows in its refusal to tidy its emotional accounts. The Tale of Genji proposes suspension as the only honest ending for a system that has worn itself thin by its own formalities. Ukifune's refusal to return to court after her survival is the novel's most radical structural statement. Here is a person who has been through the system's full process of formation and destruction and has come out the other side unwilling to re-enter. She does not overcome the court. She simply stops. And the novel, characteristically, does not tell us what to make of that. Across generations, the same patterns repeat, as much inherited habit as fate. Genji's charisma is not a cure. It leaves behind a ledger of obligations. Kaoru and those who follow inherit that ledger and the contradictions in it. Authority without solidity, beauty without trust, ritual without ethical closure. The later chapters therefore decentralize the narrative voice and scatter moral assurance. They mirror a social fragmentation made visible in private rooms, where people cannot take their place in an older, single-centered order. The novel's last movements are not tidy final acts, but the slow unwinding of a fabric whose threads were once tightly braided around one luminous life. Kaoru does not fail where Genji succeeded. He fails because Genji's particular form of success made certain forms of integrity structurally impossible for the generation that followed. So the Tale of Genji refuses the usual narrative escalation because it trusts the slow arithmetic of feeling. Emotional accumulation replaces climax. Grief gathers on the bedside. Shame gathers in the margins of a letter. Longing gathers beneath the sleeves of a dancer. And these accumulations never quite combust into a single, totalized outcome. They accrete, they ripple, they shape the social topography. Repetition functions not as redundancy, but as architecture. The same image refracts new consequences. The same ceremony enacts another transfer of responsibility. Beauty in the book has value precisely because disappearance is guaranteed. To see a face, to hold a fan, to keep a scarf becomes an act of resistance against time. The more the characters know that loss is certain, the more compulsively they collect the things that attest to presence. And the more they collect, the heavier the burden they carry, and the more certain they become that all this beauty will not be enough to hold anything together. That compulsion explains why the narrative often prefers what is unsaid. The great events are framed by omissions, a death treated as an absence rather than as narrated spectacle, a departure that becomes a structural statement when the household simply rearranges itself. Silence here is strategic. It is how the court practices restraint and how the novel asks its reader to feel what cannot be fully pronounced. The narrator's restraint, observing, offering poems, leaving moral points unpinned, keeps the text from verdict and instead makes it a lens into cultural habit. And in that restraint, the book performs its own thesis. The most important things in this world are the ones that cannot be said directly, That must be approached through season and image and the borrowed authority of an old poem. And what cannot be said directly will always leave its residue in the unsaid spaces of social life, shaping what comes next without ever being acknowledged. If then the tale of Genji offers no tidy resolution, it does offer a precise kind of knowledge. Systems outlive symbols. The court's outward order, ranks, ceremonies, carpets of gold persists, but that aesthetic persistence no longer guarantees interior health. The book's refusal of narrative closure is not an evasion, it is evidence. A civilization that can compose wondrous dances and festivals, while its people show up as exhausted, unsettled, and unadjudicated, is a civilization aware of its fatigue. The inability to conclude is the novel's final diagnosis. The forms remain, but the inward energies that once animated them are fraying. And that diagnosis, delivered from within the court by one of its women in the court's own language of suggestion and indirection, is both the most honest thing the court ever said about itself and the thing it could only say this way. That's all for today on Libeth. If you want to follow the whole journey, subscribe. One new book every week. At least we try.